Okay, we are here, Generous Theology, talking Reformed Dogmatics, and Herman Bavinck, and we are in volume 1 of his 4-volume Reformed Dogmatics, his Prolegomena. We're in part 2, the history and literature of dogmatic theology, chapter 3, the Formation of Dogma, and we are in the section of that chapter titled Dogma and Theology in the East. And this is volume 1, chapter 3, pericope 40 or paragraph 40 for those following. And I just want to say, Chuck, this is one of my favorite sections. I know I say that about every section, but this is one of my favorite sections because of its focus on the East. And I think the East holds a special place in the hearts of all Christians because primarily of some of the things that Bavinck talks about in this section. And that is to say, when the early intellectual and philosophical challenges came to Christianity in its first centuries, the Latin West had not yet sprung up, and we really see the center of mass for Christian thought in this Greek Hellenic East. And so to have Bavinck going over the main issues here is most welcome to me. Now there's another trap, of course, and the other side of the trap is that some people can turn the Greek Eastern Mediterranean of the first few centuries. Some people can turn it into the ultimate place to go for Christian orthodoxy. You know, that search for purity, Chuck, the one true church. People oftentimes want to land it in this region. And I think when we read Bavinck, we're going to find that it's a mixed bag, that there are high points, there are also low points, there are also aspects of engagement that are crucial. And I think the idea of Christianity itself being captured by this culture is perhaps its own story. It could have happened in an academic sense, Chuck. You and I thinking about the Spirit's direction of the church wouldn't necessarily think that. But I would say from a humanistic, from a secular outsider looking in on us, I could imagine a secular historian looking at this Greek Eastern Mediterranean culture and thinking that it was going to capture Christian thought, and that ended up not happening. So that's a lot of pieces to go into. Bavinck goes into a lot more there, but let me just throw it over to you for a high-level overview of what you were thinking about and maybe your own expectations about this time, this place, and this aspect of the Greek culture of the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yeah, my initial thought I think the first time when I read this, when I saw Dogma and Theology in the East, my initial thought was really about, he's going to be talking about the later East, Eastern Orthodoxy, what really comes after the 11th century, or maybe even in a few of the centuries leading up to that. But what is really important here is he does lay the foundation, as you point out, that the East in many ways was ahead of the West early on. Some of that, of course, was merely geographical. The West was not nearly as settled. It was much more threatened by the Northern European tribes that often get called barbarians. And so the East was a little bit more, the Eastern Empire was a little more settled and tied to that old Greek way of thinking. But there is so much important there in those early centuries of the Eastern Church that today, the Western Church, whether it's the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church, which really realistically is also a Western Church, at least in origin, we are so reliant on. And without the East, we would miss out. I know I heard your comment and resonate with that occasionally people go a little too far and they're sort of looking for the perfect church, and somewhere in the early church, and maybe it's in these early centuries of the East, they seem to think that that's where you can find the perfect church. I think R. Scott Clark refers to that in some cases as the quest for illegitimate certainty. We talked a little bit a few weeks ago about what he also calls the quest for illegitimate experience, but that quest for illegitimate religious certainty is, what sometimes people do, and they're looking for that in places like the early centuries of the East. But regardless, without going so far, I think what we can say is that all of us are standing on the shoulders of the giants of the early Eastern Church, to paraphrase the saying of Isaac Newton. And if it weren't for people like Athanasius, Basil, and Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa, and others, where would we be? A lot of the controversies of that era, the controversies against the Arians and the Nestorians, just really determines who we are today as Christians. And while there are still some Nestorian Christian churches in a few places around the world, and even though Arianism lives on perhaps among the Jehovah's Witnesses, for the most part, those things have been marginalized, and they became marginalized because of the work of many of these church fathers in the East. It is interesting, though, and I'd be interested in some of your thoughts on this. At the very beginning of this section, Bavinck points out that there's this great change, right, as the 4th century begins. The Edict of Toleration, what I've often heard as the Edict of Milan in 313, brought peace and quiet to the church, a peace and quiet that was soon followed by prestige and honor. And then he notes, free from external pressure, the development of theology could be more vigorous. In fact, all parts of theology were now cultivated fruitfully. But then, he notes, the moment the enemies from without had been vanquished, however, those from within began to assert themselves. And I found that really interesting. Now, it's true that there is less prior to 313 that we can rely on. The real flowering of the church fathers came after that. And some of that was certainly due to this new toleration, and in fact, in many places, more than just toleration, but adoption of Christianity as the state church. But it is also interesting how that change led to conflict within. And it strikes me that while certainly we would never pray for persecution, we would never pray for a time to come where in the West, Christianity is actively persecuted and actively suppressed by the state. But there is also a part of me that wonders, what good might come out of some of that? And it also makes me wonder, what might be happening in the church in places like China and in places like Iran. Obviously, the numbers in a place like Iran are still very small, so there may not be much opportunity. But the church in China is large. It's underground for the most part. There is obviously the official church, the I forget what it's called, the Three Unities or something like that is tolerated by the Chinese government. But for the most part, the Chinese Christian church is underground. And you wonder what's going on, and are there things that, in the next decades we may see coming out of the Chinese church, just as far as how do they respond to pressures from without, and how does that compare to the pressures that we see from within, because we're the champions or whatever. Christianity is still the most common religion in the West, perhaps secularism overtaking it. But you wonder, is there, what do you lose when you're no longer top dog, but what do you gain as well? And perhaps one of the things that you gain is a sense of unity and a sense of, not necessarily fighting about these battles. And then again, some of these internal battles that happened once the flowering of the East occurred were necessary, right? We needed them. So it was just an interesting thought. It was what was going through my mind is how does that work? How does persecution, how does the lack thereof, how does that impact the Christian church? And I think it's just a worthwhile thing to think about.
Amen, my friend. That's a beautiful layout. By the way, I agree with you. I loved Bavinck's presentation of that, those sentences that you read. The Edict of Toleration brought peace and quiet, but the moment the enemies from without had been vanquished, however, those from within began to assert themselves. And I agreed with you. That I highlighted that section in such a beautiful way, that Bavinck has categorized what I think is an extremely interesting part of the church. Now I want to answer your question, but to answer it, maybe I want to build up to it. So we're talking about the Edict of Toleration in AD 313, but let's actually go a little bit before that. What was the Christian world like in the period before this time of persecution. So it was a time of persecution. It was a time of intellectual development. But as Bavinck points out here, and one of the first things that you say is the priorities were different. When you're in a persecuted religion, and when you face the death penalty potentially for being the religion, in this case in the Roman Empire, you know that there's a clarity to so much of what religious life is about. And then with the edict, you have this peace, which by all accounts is a good thing. You're not being persecuted anymore. You're not under the peril of being put to death. And yet now the intensity, almost in a sense, maybe ratchets up in another degree as it comes down in this others. But to preface this, so in the time of the apostolic generation, the death, burial, resurrection of Christ, his ascension, the generation of the apostles, and here I'm thinking just very loosely. So the apostles and the other people who had directly either worked with the apostles themselves or with Jesus directly. So when you take that initial impetus of the church, it's largely centered in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is the city. And the Bible even talks about Paul going to Jerusalem, talks about people in Jerusalem, the church leaders meeting there to make decisions about things. Well, what happens is you have the revolt of the Jewish people in the Roman province. You have the destruction of the Second Temple in the First Jewish-Roman War in 70 AD. You have the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 132 AD. And then after that, Jerusalem is really destroyed as a center for Christianity, of course, as well as for Judaism. Now, in the light of that, you have two cities in the Mediterranean East taking over and fulfilling that role that that Jerusalem used to play. And so you have Antioch in the north, and then you have Alexandria in the south. And those two cities held very vibrant Christian communities that had very interesting interpretive approaches to the scriptures that have greatly influenced us. And it's almost a left hand, right hand sort of situation. So the Alexandrians tended to be a certain way. They tended to follow the very allegorical sorts of interpretive and hermeneutical methods. They tended to be very heavy on philosophy as well as the scriptures. You have, and we're going to talk about some of the people from that school. Then you have up in the north, the school of Antioch. This is much more an anthropic school, also much more centered on the biblical text itself versus, for example, the philosophies that the Alexandrians loved to go into. And so that's the backdrop. That's the Eastern Mediterranean in this time period during the time of the persecution. Now, with the change that opens everything up, the Edict of Toleration, you still see Antioch, you still see Alexandria playing these intense roles, but you see also just this explosion of different places of interest, and you see the Christian faith popping up. The biggest notable thing during this section that Bavinck is talking about is not what Bavinck is talking about in this section, and that is the rise, the emergence of the Latin West. Prior to the Edict of Toleration, you do have some church figures in the West. Obviously, think of Paul going to Rome and writing the epistle to the Romans for that church's benefit. So you even have people in the Latin West, even from the very beginning, but in terms of the same center of gravity that the Mediterranean East has, it's new. And so what we have here is we have the pressure of the internal heresies starting to rise. And so think of heresies, Arianism, Montanism, several other situations that come up. And here's how it tends to go, Chuck. I'm a learned man and I read the scriptures, and my learning in other areas influences what I understand of the scriptures. and I start talking about Jesus, and I start talking about Jesus the carpenter. Jesus is this way, and carpenters love wood, and carpenters love building things. And because of that, in my ministry, in my approach, I'm sympathizing with this, and I'm talking about Jesus in a certain way, and I'm talking about God in a certain way. Meanwhile, you grow up and you have a different situation, a different situs, a different background, context, location, and Jesus is something else to you. Well, the Christian faith is so new at this point, relatively speaking, that there's still plenty of room for the influence of individual personalities on the character of the church. And so we see even Arius's critics acknowledging some of the virtues that Arianist movements brought to Christianity. Now, what was the problem? The problem was if I'm virtuous in one sense, I also might bring vice in, and we see that here. And so the Latin West is not in a position to yet address many of these movements, and Jerusalem is no more. And so now we see it's really the center of gravity is the Christian Eastern Mediterranean. And I think that's what Bavinck's pointing out. So again, think of folks like you mentioned, Alexander, Athanasius, Basil, Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, Didymus, Origen, Tertullian, so many people. As a matter of fact, by the way, if we just talk about Alexandria, think about there's a long line of Alexandrian thinkers here. We have Pantanaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, who we mentioned before, Dionysius, Theonostus, Peter of Alexandria, and just these long lines through this century of thinkers. And so Bavinck is pointing and is setting the stage, and it comes down to the theologians in this East to answer. And so where are the attacks coming from? There are maybe two major sources for attacks in an overall sense. Of course, everything was under attack all the time, but in terms of the church responding, so it tended to be around the doctrine of God, who is God, and then it tended to be around the person of Jesus, or what you and I today call Christology, the science, the study of who Jesus is as presented in the Holy Scriptures. And you and I today have really nice textbooks that give us the answers in nice, neat forms presented in ways that are pedagogically appealing, so that you and I can read these nice textbooks and maybe forget that in some sense, the Mediterranean East was somewhat of a Wild West, making a reference here to the American Wild West, the period of gunslingers. This was a period of drama, of intensity. And so these controversies are coming around, and it concerns the essence of God. It concerns the nature of Christ. And so those are the two major points. And of course, there's lots of minor points. But Chuck, how does that fit in what you're thinking and what you're seeing in Bavinck here?
Yeah, it definitely fits, and it is such an important history, and it is one that sometimes I think we as modern Christians forget and don't pay close enough attention to. I think there's some movement back towards that, but it's really important to be aware of not only these early fathers who did so much writing, who contested a lot of these issues, but also to be aware of the various disputes, the various heresy. I've heard it said that there's not been a new heresy in 1,000 years, and I'm not sure that that's really true, but the point that person was making is that so much of the heretical or problematic theology that we run into even today finds a parallel in some of the heresies of the early era, and I think that's important to note. It means that we have a history that we can look back on, and while history is not the be all and end all, and these writers, these historic writers of the 4th century and 5th century and beyond are certainly not to the level of Scripture. They're not perfect. They're not infallible. But still, they're a tool that we ought not to lose sight of. And of course, many of our own theological heroes, people like John Calvin and Martin Luther did just that. They spent a lot of time with the early church fathers and the writings of both Eastern and Western thinkers, and that's important to do, and to remember that history, I think, is really key, and a history that continued for some time. We often think. We often think of some of the earliest ones where Athanasius was fighting against his opponents. We often think of that as the be all and end all. But as Bavinck points out, even later, there's Chalcedon in 451. But even that Chalcedonian formula, as he put it, failed to bring peace. The monophysitism of the East was strong, and there was a confused situation that became even more confused. And there continued to be strong defenders of monophysitism. And in fact, at the Fifth Synod of Constantinople, that was recognized. It's almost like they brought back in that heresy. And so that led to further conflicts in the 7th century. And even today, as Bavinck notes, in Syria to this very day, there are monophysite Christians. I believe there are monophysite Christians in many parts of the Middle East, although much of the Middle Eastern church has been decimated in the last 20 to 30 years. But the Coptic Christians in Egypt are monophysite. Some of the Ethiopian Christians are. And so it's important to know about those things. I think Gnosticism as well. A lot of that came earlier, but yet those early challenges to Gnosticism, the earliest writings, which often were opposed to Gnosticism, despite the fact that they were there, Gnosticism seems to continue to raise its ugly head, and Bavinck points that out as well. That view of Gnosticism kept making its raising its ugly head, and I think even today we see a little bit of that. I was at a seminar on Saturday with Brian Fickert from the Chalmers Center in Lookout Mountain, Georgia. And one of the points that he makes is that so many Christians today subscribe to what he calls evangelical Gnosticism, which is this idea that we can separate body and soul, and that the soul is what's important. It's only that soul, and the mind seems to be often part of that, is all that matters, and the physical matters very little. And so we then tend to act as if that's the case, that the body doesn't matter, the physical doesn't matter. And so we think of ourselves as just simply souls waiting to be saved with bodies that just live in this world. And so the rules for our souls are one thing, but the rules for our bodies are no different than Western naturalism. And so Monday through Saturday we live one way, and on Sunday we live a different way. And obviously that's also a problem. And so we see this repeat. And what's that old saying? Those who fail to learn history are condemned to repeat it. And to some extent, I think we see that sometimes in the repeat of some of these heresies from the earliest of days. So it's something we need to stay in touch with and continue to study and continue to understand.
Chuck, thank you for that. I think one of the most, let me back up. There are two important points for me that come out of this section over and above its historic value and the perspective Bavinck organizes his content by. So I would say that this pericope, this paragraph, let me go back and double check here, number 40. I don't want to get anybody in trouble for cheating on their history exam. But if you wanted to summarize this period from the Edict of Toleration, and I would say up until maybe the Arab conquest in the 7th century, I think Bavinck's paragraph 40, it is a beautiful essay on that most important time period. And by the way, you could have an entire graduate school level class on the issues that come up in this section of the church in this time period. And so the chances of a survey doing any justice to the issues is very low. So we're not going to do a deep dive here, even though, of course, this is eminently deep diveable. I think one of the main things is to note maybe the tragedy of the Eastern Mediterranean. And the perspective here is that in some sense, I personally get a sense that civilization rises and falls in these cycles. And the Eastern Mediterranean civilization in its Christian form is going to fall. And what do we see in this culture before the fall. We see very high levels of accomplishment. We see individuals doing the creative tasks of theology at a very high level. We see the absolute best in terms of sustained scholarship and intellectual inquiry. And normally, naively to us humans, that really seems like, wow, this is a civilization poised for great things. For look at the sophistication in their theology, look at the depth of learning and scholarship, look at the integration with philosophy. But Chuck, it occurs to me that this is maybe actually indications of the rot of a civilization. Now, it's a rot that we have to decide if it's better, if the disease is better, is worse than the cure. I didn't say that right. But the point is naively, we're going to think that more learned situations and more advanced cultures are going to do better in terms of their spiritual growth and development. But if we look at the Eastern Mediterranean, we see perhaps almost the exact opposite. We see the fall into pluralism. We see the endless splintering and fragmentation in this culture. And we see the endless arguments that religion is sometimes infamous for. And our critics make great hay for pointing it out against us with. And in the very end of things, just a few centuries later, the whole region is going to be swept and fallen into the dustbin of history and is going to be replaced by a new religion. And to be honest with you, one of the things that I am concerned with in this paragraph is I'm concerned with how well the narrative might, in some senses, seem to fit our own day. Is the Christian West, as progressive as we are with our scholarship, as far advanced as we are with our subtlety, our nuanced, our philosophies, are we any more spiritually vital than we were when we were less sophisticated? And I think that's an open question. I don't want to make it sound like the thesis has been proved conclusively, but I'm very concerned because I see the same sort of, you mentioned it before, moralistic therapeutic deism. We've mentioned some of the other strains of post-Christian, post-biblical ideas of faith in Christ. And in fact, we're even wondering, and I think Bavinck is going to say in other places, that this is almost what defines modernism in a certain sense. Now, Chuck, I recognize I'm possibly painting a picture here that is too simplistic. But at the same point in time, there are some eerie parallels, and what you said really makes sense to me. Those history doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. And those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it. So that's the warning I take from this section, and look at it introspectively for ourselves. And I wonder, is that fair? Chuck, how does it look to you from your vantage point?
Yeah, I think it's always worth thinking about. It's always worth comparing ourselves to others in history and learning from that history. I found it interesting, too, that Bavinck, in talking a little bit about, and now we're in sort of Pericope 41, he talks about how there's this transition, right? The patristic period comes to an end maybe with Justinian in the 6th century, or maybe as late as Photius, who is in the 9th century. And there is that period of time between the 6th and 9th century where there are some things going on, the iconoclastic controversy. That's something I remember learning about in junior high church history. And so some of that was still going on. But then you really once you get past those things, Bavinck, it's interesting. Bavinck describes this Byzantine period extending from the 9th century until the capture of Constantinople by the Turks in 1453 as a time of quiescence, of powerlessness in production. The Greek church is the church of orthodoxy. It only preserves. And I find that interesting and something that I think we also have to think about. There is, I think, sometimes a tendency for us to look back, and I'm talking about us as Reformed Christians, right? there is sometimes a tendency for us to look back, let's say the 16th century or maybe into the 17th century, as being the high point of the Reformation. And in many ways, of course, it was. That's when a lot was happening. You've got John Calvin, you've got a lot of the folks who were writing, the Reformed writers of that era, and the high point of Reformed scholasticism, I think you might say. But we have to be careful to not lose the old saying of the reformers, per reformata, always reforming. And there is a sense in which I can see in Bavinck's discussion of this Byzantine period, an Eastern church that no longer spent time reforming itself, that no longer spent the time looking at its own, at itself as potentially flawed, looking at what was going on around it as something to be reacted to and to apply the truths of Scripture to, and instead becoming, as he puts it, quiescent and focused more on preserving rather than reforming. And that can be a concern if all we want to do is stick with the confessions of the 16th century, as great as they are, and I wouldn't want to lose them, but without applying them to today and applying them to the philosophical and theological concerns that come because of our interaction with the modern world and even the postmodern world. There's a danger that we too could become a quiescent church, a church that only preserves, even if that particular dogma that we're preserving, as in the Eastern Church, it was the Christological dogma, the dogma par excellence, and something it's very good that we have, but if that's all you're doing, that's not enough. And I think there is this call for us as Christians to constantly be engaging with the world, to always be. Church's role is not to separate itself from the world per se, as in some ivory tower or up on some mountain, but rather to engage with the world. Sometimes that means striving against the world, but engaging with the world in a way that use the work of moving towards the kingdom of God in its which will finally come in its fullness when Christ returns. But we're not here just waiting for Christ to return. We're here working. We're here doing the work of God's kingdom servants. And if we forget that, we could become somewhat like that Byzantine church, which, Bavinck points out there is some writing that happens during that era, but you almost get the sense that he was struggling to find anything. Okay, here are a few books that were written in the 12th, 13th century in the Eastern Church, like maybe listing everyone he could find, and obviously is a concern. And he points out a few places where there were some things going on. He talks about attempts at union with Rome and a couple of councils, some of the correspondence between the theologians in Tübingen and the patriarch Jeremiah, some of those things. But as he puts it then, sort of, man, when I read this, it was like, he's really putting the slam down on the Eastern Church of this era. He says, one cannot encapsulate the history of this literature in a single word, petrification, orthodoxism, or the like. But by doing that, he's sort of saying, but that is the key of what was happening. There were other things, but there's also some petrification going on. There's orthodoxism rather than orthodoxy that happens. And then he points out, which I think is really interesting and probably could even get into discussions of modern politics, but he talks about how the Greek church's center of gravity ended up being transferred to Russia. And if it weren't for Russia, if it weren't for the fact that the Eastern Church found support in Russia, a country that was Christianized in the 10th century, the orthodoxy of the East might have been totally destroyed, as it was in other parts of the Eastern world, in places like Iraq and Iran and India, and not totally destroyed, but very much marginalized or reduced to the level of a sect. And it's only because of Russia that we've continued to have this orthodoxy. And of course, the Greek church has been restored as well once Greece became independent from the Ottoman Empire. But and Bavinck points out, and he's writing this 120 years ago, but it's still true today. He says Russia's still very young. The Greek church's center of gravity has been transferred to Russia, and Russia is still young, as yet it has no past and is just emerging. And there's a sense in which we could probably say that today. because in Bavinck's day, we hadn't had the October Revolution yet. 17 hadn't come along, but that whole period of 1917 to 1991, when communism ruled Russia, that in essence put on hold a lot of the Russian Orthodox Church as well, and they're still today just beginning to emerge from that and trying to figure out what place do they have in the world. And I'm aware, just because I have a few acquaintances who are Orthodox, that today there's still quite a bit of controversy about how tied the Russian Orthodox Church and the Patriarch in Moscow, how tied he is to the Russian government, and thus unwilling perhaps to speak truth to power, which has led to further splintering of the Orthodox Church in other parts of the world. And yeah, those are all things, and that touches on our concerns about what happens when we get into power, and are we more focused on keeping ourselves in power rather than preserving the gospel? What happens when others come along and marginalize us and we're just trying to survive? What happens in those circumstances? And it's a really interesting discussion and to think about and wonder what is yet to come in the Eastern Church. I know that, and I think you're probably aware too, that probably 15, 20 years ago, there was talk about how the Orthodox Church had become kind of hip among younger folks, and there was this move to Eastern Orthodoxy. I think there's still a little bit of that happening, perhaps not in the same numbers as was happening 15, 20 years ago. But if it's hip to be Eastern Orthodox, what does that mean when Eastern Orthodoxy still is rising out of a time when, as Bavinck puts it, they almost have no history because of more recent events, both the end of the Byzantine Empire more further ago, and then the fall of much of the eastern part of Europe anyway into communism. All really interesting things to think about. Yeah, there's so much we could probably talk about there as well.
My friend, what a specter. Bavinck really, in the last part of that paragraph 41, summarizes the ultimate move of the Greek Orthodox Church, like you said, to the nation of Russia. And yet Bavinck died in 1921. So right in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. And what a turn of events. I could imagine knocking Professor Bavinck over with a feather if I could go back in time and give him a brief history of what has happened to that land since the fall in the Soviet Revolution. And what does that mean today? I think it's worth having that discussion. I have noticed that people in the West who are attracted to Eastern ideas often are attracted because of its, are often attracted because of its novelty. It is so different than the kind of Christianity we're used to in the West, that it offers opportunity for many people to explore something quite different while still maintaining an orthodoxy and a link with the Christian past. And of course, I don't oppose that investigation or inquiry, but it's going to be interesting to see where that future is. And Chuck, if the Lord gives, the Lord can take away. And what we've seen in this section is we've seen a cycle of the Lord giving great theological vigor and blessing. And we see the vitality of it in a society, and yet we also see the Lord taking away. And that almost takes my breath, Chuck, to consider and think about the situation for my land. I have this suspicion that it is better to be wise and sophisticated over being simple, but it is better to be simple than to be too sophisticated and so wise that one ceases to be able to walk in wisdom. Now, as sophisticated and as advanced as we are today, Chuck, we're struggling. We're struggling with basic terms, basic things that we ought not to struggle with. What is a woman? What is a recession? What is a democracy? What is a vote? These are all terms that are being rewritten. What is justice? We are finding that we're in the midst of a rewrite in dictionaries, in lexicons, in the culture. And this is very troubling. these are very troubling turns, that we should have to face a situation where we who once were simple, but at least had the wisdom to know. For example, the answer to the question, what is a woman? Now we have to take a graduate level class to discuss and understand the complexities of this issue. And when we come out of that class, do we even have an answer? I think there is an indictment to the idea of sophistication and progress as always being good things. Now, having said that, of course, Chuck, you and I make our trade by being more sophisticated than simple. And so we're not rejecting sophistication for its own sake. But there does seem to be an aspect of cultures spoiling or curdling, for lack of a better word, followed by a period of decline and followed by invasion, renewal, a plowing under. In a sense, can we almost commoditize? Can we think of human cultures as different crops growing in a field for a season, and then comes a different season, and the same farmer who planted one crop in that field for a time has his harvest, plows the ground under, and then plants another crop? That could be too pessimistic. It could get awfully dark. But Chuck, we're looking at Bavinck, looking at Russia on the eve of the fall into the secular Soviet state. It's hard to get darker than that. How would you finish up this section?
Yeah, I think I would finish by saying, hey, there's a lot of important threads here, both the positive threads of the great theology that was done at certain times and some of the great thinkers of the era, but that we also have to think about the flip side of that. And there's a need to always be aware that there is often that flip side. I think also I'm excited to now move on to the next pericope, which we'll talk about next time, I think, Dogma and Theology in the West, and to do a little bit of comparing and contrasting. Comparing because I think there are some parallels, and there could continue to be some parallels. Contrasting because there are also some very much areas of contrast and difference. And of course, given that we as Protestant Christians, and especially those of us in the Reformed tradition, we come out of the West. There's no doubt of that. We've had maybe some contact with the East, but we really come out of the tradition of the West. That tree, we're a branch more close to the Roman Catholic Church than we are to the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so it'll be important then as we think about dogma and theology in the West and to understand that that's telling some of our story, even as we pay attention to things that happened and continue to happen in the East. So I'm looking forward to that for next time, to thinking about dogma and theology and historical development of it in the West.